Hello and welcome to the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9. I'm Paul Kretschmer. On today's broadcast, we'll be speaking with a person who is deaf who lives in Northern California. She'll talk to us about how to relate to the deaf.
My name is Rachel Zamok, and I live in North California, and I'm deaf. You're hearing my voice, but I am relying on an interpreter to understand the interviewer. So I'm using a special kind of telephone because I became deaf when I was 10. I can talk, but I rely on sign language to understand somebody on the phone, and it's good to be here.
Thank you very much for your time today. What was the incidence that caused you to be deaf at 10 years old?
I lived in England at the time, and at school, we had a school-wide hearing test, and that identified that I was deaf in one ear, and I was sent to an audiologist who told me to be very careful of the other ear and protect it. And I made jokes about how can I protect an ear. And 2 weeks later, I was swinging in our house. We used to swing over the staircase just for fun. And I fell, I slipped and fell and hit a bone in the inner ear of my good ear. And it knocked all the hearing out of that ear immediately. So all of a sudden I was completely deaf. It's not a very typical story.
Were any other members of your family deaf, or were you the only one in the family you grew up in that was partially and then completely deaf?
I do have one relative who is deaf.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was the things they did to help you go through school then? Did you have to, I presume you had to go to a special school where you would learn sign and all of that?
You know, the funny thing is that they did not even think, my parents didn't even think of putting me into a deaf school. They had me go to a boarding school. I tried, at first I went back to my regular school, and things started happening there that showed them that it wasn't working out for me to go back to a regular school. For example, a fire alarm. I didn't hear the alarm, so I was completely oblivious. And all the other kids went outside and lined up, but I stayed in the classroom. And when I looked up, the room was empty. So things like that happened, and they realized they needed an alternative. And they found a boarding school, but it had nothing to do with deafness. It was just a boarding school that advertised having small classes. If I'm honest, I feel like my education ended when I was 10. Formal education really ended at age 10 because all the schools that I attended, with the exception of one, were inaccessible to me until I somehow managed to graduate high school.
It must have.
The one school that.
It must have been very challenging for you.
No, you know, in some ways, school was challenging because I was really curious and I really wanted to learn. So when I was taking classes in high school, like criminal law and psychology and English, I was super interested in them. So those were frustrating moments for me, for sure. Or when I was among friends and I couldn't hear them. I didn't even know the names of my group of friends that I hung out with every day, because that's something you pick up from hearing. So it definitely was frustrating in some ways, but it also gave me a gift, a huge gift, and that is a direction in my life that I went in. I became a teacher of the deaf. I learned sign language. I met the deaf community. I attended a deaf school when I was 14, and those things are among the richest things in my life.
If I understood you correctly, this all happened when your family was in England. At what point were you here in the United States then?
We moved here a couple of years later. Maybe I was 13 when we moved here.
I understand that there are. I understand there are some words that people use, hearing people primarily, I think, that have a different meaning for someone such as yourself, who does not have the physical capability of hearing in your life. Could you explain to me, perhaps, if I've got that right, or if I need to rephrase my question for you?
No, I absolutely understand. So that's a great question, because terminology is really important. There are different terms, and there are some terms that you may be familiar with, or that you and other hearing people will immediately use, and they'll think that those are the best words to use, like hearing impaired, or hearing loss, or hard of hearing. And the idea that those words are the better words come from a certain mindset that to be deaf is a negative thing, that the word deaf, especially if you're spelling deaf with a capital D, many people will think, wait a minute, why would you capitalize deaf? Deaf is a negative thing. A capital letter doesn't feel like a negative thing. But the truth is that within the deaf community, the feeling is that a capital D is a more positive representation of us and more appropriate. And the word hearing impaired it means that we're broken in some way. There's something impaired about us. So it's offensive. And the phrase hearing loss is also inappropriate, because most deaf people were born that way. So they didn't lose anything. And then on another level, if you find the experience in the deaf world a very positive one, enriching, empowering, even thrilling sometimes, then you don't feel it's a loss. But again,
it seems interesting that in society's pursuit of attempting to be more gracious or less negative, describing things, that in fact, as you've described for the last couple of minutes, what hearing people sometimes say are not necessarily respectful, even when they don't mean to be disrespectful.
Right, exactly. And I don't think hearing people have bad intentions. Almost never. I think it's simple lack of understanding and lack of exposure to this idea. And then also, even if they are exposed to the idea, it's really hard for them to adjust their thinking to where being deaf could be a positive thing, because their whole life is centered around hearing and sound and music. So there's a lot that is just hidden from view to hearing people. And so I wrote a book trying to reverse that and reveal more about our experience and the deaf world to hearing people who simply have no exposure.
Would you be able to share some excerpts of what you've written? Because I have a feeling that it will explain some things for listeners much better.
Okay, yeah, because when I wrote the book, I spent so long carefully figuring out how to phrase things best that sometimes now when people ask me a question, I just say, well, read that part of the book, because it explains things better than I can at this point. So I'd be happy to share some excerpts with you. This is from the prologue, and it's describing my book, which is a memoir about teaching deaf children in a public school, a mainstream hearing school. I taught a deaf class. I capitalized the word deaf throughout this book. I'm not following the common deaf norm of using uppercase D to refer to those who are culturally deaf, and lowercase d for those who aren't. Rather, I use deaf with a capital D to describe everyone who does not have normal hearing. I know this will perplex some people and offend others, but I view the capital D as positive, connoting competence and pride, and I wanted to include everyone under that single empowering umbrella. That's one of the excerpts.
Is there another one, perhaps, that you would like to share that has particular significance for you?
Yes, I have another one that is also from the prologue, but a previous version of the prologue. In other words, it's not in the book, so your audience is getting to read it exclusively. I belong to a parents group on Facebook. Their parents obsess about decibel level. How much can their child hear exactly? But by contrast, in culturally deaf groups, very little is ever mentioned about hearing. It's simply not a concern. Everything else is prioritized, more captivating than actual hearing levels. Cultural affinity, humor, success, events, problem solving, life, everything but sound. This point was driven home to me one day on a beach. I was there with a deaf friend whose family is deaf going back many generations. She'd been educated and herself had taught in many deaf schools. I'd never seen nor cared to see her talk, for she and I always signed. We spread our towels and settled. I got out my trusty flask of coffee and a book I was sure to ignore. She, meanwhile, set up a round machine with earplugs and started nodding blissfully, eyes closed, singing along to music. Singing, hearing and singing. I was astonished, for I'd always thought of her as profoundly deaf. Others would have viewed her that way too, while labeling me hard of hearing, since I used my voice and she didn't. But physically, she had far more hearing than I. When I tried on her earplug, I heard absolutely nothing. From that incident and many others, I learned how little actual hearing is relevant to how someone lives in the world, and that levels of hearing have nothing to do with success or happiness. From observing my students, I learned more. And the point of that excerpt was that this is a woman who, my friend, is a person who calls herself deaf with a capital D. From the moment she was a kindergartner, she knew that her identity was deaf with a capital D because of what surrounded her. And it had nothing to do with how much hearing she had, which is actually quite a lot compared to me.
There is a school for the deaf in West Hartford, Connecticut, called the American School for the Deaf. It goes way back to its founding by Gallaudet. Do educational schools like that have a positive impact for someone like yourself, or does it perpetuate some of the stereotypes that hearing people may have?
Oh, deaf schools, and that one for sure, are fantastic. Deaf schools are wildly different from the kind of schools that 85% of all deaf and hard of hearing children in this country attend. Those are mainstream or hearing schools. The majority attend hearing school, but 10% deaf children in this country attend deaf schools, and they give them a much richer sense of culture and language and community. So they're very, very important.
If a person would like to obtain a copy of your book, then where do you direct them?
They can go to Paper Angel Press online. It's available. It was just released yesterday. And there's an imprint of Paper Angel Press called Unruly Voices, and that's the part of the Paper Angel website where you'll find my book. But just type in The Butterfly Cage by Rachel Zemach. It's spelled Z-E-M-A-C-H, and the book should pop up.
My thanks to Rachel Zemach and her interpreter, who voiced the words that Rachel spoke to me in response to my questions. For further information, call at 860-346-1049. The opinions expressed are those of the participants, not necessarily those of the staff or management of this station. I'm Paul Kretschmer for the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9 WIHS.